The stars had always seemed peaceful to the people of Earth. For centuries, humans had looked up at the night sky and wondered if they were alone. They built telescopes and sent probes into the darkness. They dreamed of meeting other beings from distant worlds. But when that meeting finally came, it was not the friendly encounter they had imagined. The Valdrix Empire arrived on a cold morning in March of the year 2187. Their fleet appeared without warning, blocking out the sun over 3 continents at once. 300 warships, each one larger than anything humanity had ever built, hung in the sky like mountains of metal and fire. Commander Jake Morrison was eating breakfast with his daughter when the news came. His phone buzzed with an emergency alert, and within seconds, every screen in his house showed the same image. Dark shapes against the clouds. Ships that seemed to go on forever. His daughter Lucy looked at him with wide eyes. She was only 12 years old, too young to understand what was happening, but old enough to see the fear on her father's face. Jake kissed her forehead and told her to stay with her mother. Then he grabbed his uniform and ran. The drive to the military base took 20 minutes. The roads were already filling with people trying to escape the cities. Jake saw families loading cars with whatever they could carry. He saw children crying in back seats. He saw the beginning of panic. At the base, everything was chaos. Soldiers ran in every direction. Officers shouted orders that no one seemed to hear. Jake pushed through the crowd until he found his ship, the carrier Defiance. It was the largest vessel in the human fleet. But compared to the alien ships overhead, it looked like a toy. Lieutenant Katie Warren met him at the entrance. She was a young woman with short brown hair and sharp green eyes. She had served under Jake for 5 years, and he trusted her more than anyone else in the fleet. "They sent a message," she said, handing him a tablet. "Admiral Zorvek. He's giving us 72 hours to surrender." Jake read the message as they walked. The alien commander had written in perfect English, which meant they had been watching humanity for a long time. The message was simple. Surrender and become part of the Valdrix Empire, or be destroyed. There would be no negotiation. There would be no mercy. "What do we know about them?" Jake asked. Katie led him to the bridge, where a holographic display showed everything they had learned in the past few hours. The Valdrix had conquered 17 star systems. They had never lost a major battle. Their technology was hundreds of years more advanced than anything on Earth. "Their ships have shields that can stop our best weapons," Katie explained. "Their guns can cut through our armor like paper, and they outnumber us 4-1. Jake stared at the display for a long moment. Around him, his crew worked in silence. They all knew the numbers. They all knew what those numbers meant. "Where's Danny?" he asked. "In the engine room. He hasn't stopped working since the ships appeared." Jake nodded and headed down to find his chief engineer. Danny Ruiz was a small man with thick glasses and oil-stained hands. He had grown up in a poor neighborhood and had taught himself engineering from old books. Now he was the smartest person Jake had ever met. Danny was standing in front of a massive machine, talking to himself as he worked. When he saw Jake, he put down his tools and wiped his hands on his shirt. "I've been looking at their signals," Danny said. "The Valdrix use a specific frequency for their shields. If we can find the right counter frequency, we might be able to shut them down." "How long?" "Weeks, maybe months. We don't have that kind of time." Jake put his hand on Danny's shoulder. "Do what you can. Every advantage matters." Back on the bridge, Katie had gathered the other senior officers. Captain Ben Harper had arrived from the Eastern Fleet. He was a big man with a loud voice and a scar across his chin from an old training accident. Captain Megan Torres commanded the Southern Wing. She was quiet and careful, the kind of leader who thought 3 steps ahead of everyone else. They all looked at Jake, waiting for him to speak. "The Valdrix have never fought anyone like us," Jake said. "They've conquered species that gave up before the first shot was fired. They don't know what it means to face an enemy that refuses to quit." Ben crossed his arms. That's nice talk, but talk won't stop those ships. No, Jake agreed. But we're not going to fight those ships. Not directly. He pulled up a map of the solar system on the display. The asteroid belt stretched between Mars and Jupiter, a field of rocks and debris that had been there since the beginning of time. We hide, Jake said. We scatter our fleet through the belt. We use the rocks as cover, and when they come looking for us, we hit them from the shadows. Megan leaned forward, studying the map. Guerrilla warfare, in space. They expect us to line up and fight like every other species they've conquered. We're not going to do that. We're going to make them bleed for every inch of this system. Katie looked worried. If we run, people will panic. They'll think we've given up. Jake shook his head. We're not running. We're changing the rules. The Valdrix think this is their game. We're going to show them it's ours. The countdown continued. 60 hours until the deadline. The human fleet began its move toward the asteroid belt, leaving Earth behind. To the Valdrix watching from above, it looked like retreat. It looked like surrender. Admiral Zorvek smiled when he saw the human ships scatter. He had seen Tias before. Weak species always ran when they realized they couldn't win. He would give them their 72 hours, and then he would hunt them down one by one. He had no idea what was waiting for him in the darkness between the rocks. On the Defiance, Jake Morrison watched Earth grow smaller in the view screen. His daughter was down there. His the asteroid belt was cold and dark and endless. Rocks the size of mountains floated through the black, spinning slowly in the silence of space. No sound, no light except the distant glow of the sun. It was the perfect place to disappear. Commander Jake Morrison had divided his fleet into 30 small groups. Each group had 3 or 4 ships, just enough firepower to be dangerous but small enough to hide. They spread out across millions of miles, tucking themselves behind asteroids and inside craters. The Valdrix came looking for them on the 4th day. Admiral Zorvek sent 50 ships into the belt, confident that his sensors would find the humans within hours. His technology could detect heat signatures from thousands of miles away. His scanners could map every rock and shadow. Nothing could hide from the Valdrix. But humans had spent their entire history learning to hide. On the Defiance, Katie Warren watched the enemy ships enter the belt. She had spent days studying Valdrix sensor technology, learning its strengths and weaknesses. Now she knew exactly how to avoid detection. "Cut all engines," she ordered. "Switch to cold running. No heat signatures. No electronic signals. We're a rock until I say otherwise." The ship went dark. The crew worked by the glow of emergency lights, moving quietly as if the enemy might hear them through the vacuum of space. It was uncomfortable and scary, but it worked. The Valdrix ships passed within 10 miles of the Defiance and never saw it. The first attack came 3 days later. Captain Ben Harper had positioned his group behind a large asteroid near the edge of the belt. He watched through a telescope as a Valdrix cruiser moved past, searching the darkness for signs of human life. "Wait for it," Ben whispered to his crew. "Wait until they're committed." The cruiser moved closer, its sensors sweeping back and forth. Ben could see the alien crew through the viewports, strange, tall beings with gray skin and 4 arms. They looked bored. They looked like they expected to find nothing. Now! 3 human ships burst from their hiding spots, engines flaring to life. They crossed the distance in seconds, firing everything they had at the cruiser's engines before the aliens could react. The Valdrix shields held against the missiles. But the engines were a different story. Human weapons punched through the exhaust ports and tore the cruiser's propulsion system apart. The ship spun out of control, crashing into an asteroid and breaking in half. Ben and his ships disappeared back into the darkness before the nearest Valdrix vessel could respond. Admiral Zorvek received the report with confusion. One of his cruisers had been destroyed, and no one had seen who did it. The attackers had appeared from nowhere and vanished just as quickly. He sent more ships to investigate. They found the wreckage, but no sign of the human fleet. It was as if the enemy had melted into the rocks themselves. "They are using the asteroids as cover," one of his officers suggested. "We should spread out and search every hiding spot." Zorvek agreed. He divided his hunting party into smaller groups, each one assigned to search a different section of the belt. It was exactly what Jake Morrison wanted him to do. Over the next 2 weeks, the human fleet picked off Valdric's ships one by one. They attacked from behind asteroids and from inside craters. They used the weak gravity of small rocks to slingshot around their targets. They fought in ways the aliens had never seen before. Megan Torres developed a technique she called shadow running. Her ships would drift without power, using only tiny bursts of compressed air to adjust their course. They could float right past enemy patrols without being detected, then strike when the moment was right. Danny Ruiz built devices that mimicked Valdric's signals, making empty rocks look like human ships on alien scanners. The enemy wasted days chasing ghosts, while the real fleet prepared its next attack. Katie Warren created a communication system using reflected light instead of radio waves. The Valdrics couldn't intercept what they couldn't detect. Human ships coordinated their attacks across vast distances, striking together with perfect timing. By the end of the 3rd week, Admiral Zorvek had lost 30 ships without destroying a single human vessel. The alien fleet was getting scared. Zorvek sat alone in his quarters, trying to understand what was happening. His people had conquered 17 star systems. They had faced enemies with better technology, larger numbers, and stronger defenses. They had never lost. But they had never faced an enemy like this. The humans didn't fight fair. They didn't line up for battle like civilized beings. They hid and ran and struck from the shadows like animals. It was beneath the dignity of the Valdrics to fight this way, and yet it was working. On the Defiance, Jake Morrison allowed himself a small smile when Katie reported the latest victory. Another Valdric's destroyer had been crippled near the outer edge of the belt. Its crew had surrendered after their life support failed. "We're winning," Katie said, but her voice was cautious. Jake nodded. "We're surviving. That's not the same thing." He knew the truth. They had hurt the enemy, but they hadn't broken them. Admiral Zorvek still had over 200 ships. He could afford to lose 30 more and still have enough firepower to burn Earth to ash. The humans needed something bigger. They needed a victory so complete that the Valdrics would question whether this war was worth fighting. Jake called his officers together for a meeting aboard the Defiance. Ben Harper arrived first, his face tired but proud. Megan Torres came next, quiet as always. Danny Ruiz joined them last, his hands dirty from working on his latest invention. "We've been playing defense," Jake said. "It's kept us alive, but it won't win the war. We need to hit them somewhere that matters." Ben leaned forward. "They're supply lines. They've got transport ships bringing fuel and ammunition from outside the system. Without those supplies, their fleet dies." Megan shook her head. "Too far. We'd have to leave the belt, and they'd see us coming." Danny raised his hand. "I've been working on something. It's not finished yet, but if I can get a few more days." He explained his idea. A device that could disrupt Valdric's shields by broadcasting a specific frequency. The device would only work for 90 seconds, but during that time, enemy ships would be completely vulnerable. "How close do we need to be?" Jake asked. "Close. Very close. But if we can get a team onto one of their big ships, we could plant the device directly on their shield generator." The room went quiet. What Danny was suggesting was almost impossible. Boarding an enemy warship, fighting through hundreds of aliens, and planting a device that might not even work. But impossible was all they had left. Jake looked at his officers. They were tired and scared and far from home. But there was something else in their eyes. something that had kept humanity alive through ice ages and plagues and wars, something the Valdrix had never learned to recognize. Hope. Fear was a strange thing. The Valdrix had studied it for thousands of years. They knew how to create it in their enemies. They knew how to use it as a weapon. But they had forgotten what it felt like to experience it themselves. Lieutenant Chris Dawson was about to remind them. Chris was a young officer with red hair and freckles. He had grown up on a farm in the middle of nowhere, and he still talked with a slow, relaxed voice that made people underestimate him. But behind that calm exterior was a mind that understood warfare in ways that scared even his commanders. Jake Morrison had given Chris a special mission. While the rest of the fleet attacked Valdrix ships directly, Chris and his small team would attack something more valuable: their minds. The captured Valdrix scout ship drifted through space on the edge of the alien fleet. Chris and 4 other soldiers sat inside, wearing stolen uniforms and speaking in broken Valdrix language that Danny Ruiz had taught them from captured communication devices. "Remember," Chris said to his team, "we're not here to kill anyone. We're here to make them afraid." The plan was simple, but cruel. They would broadcast messages into the Valdrix communication network, images of destroyed ships, recordings of dying crews, warnings that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. They started small, a single image of a burning cruiser, sent to every ship in the fleet at the same time. The Valdrix officers tried to trace the source but found nothing. The message had appeared like a ghost. 2 days later, they sent another message. This time, it was a voice, speaking in perfect Valdrix language. It said only 5 words: "We know where you sleep." On Admiral Zorvek's flagship, the crew began to panic. Soldiers who had never known fear suddenly found themselves jumping at shadows. Officers who had commanded fleets for centuries began questioning their own sensors. Zorvek tried to maintain order, but even he felt the cold touch of doubt. How did the humans know their language so well? How did they send messages that couldn't be traced? What else did they know? The psychological attacks continued for weeks. Chris and his team moved through the Valdrix fleet like phantoms, always one step ahead of the search parties sent to find them. They left messages on view screens. They hacked into personal communication devices. They made the aliens feel watched, even when they were alone. One night, Chris broadcast a recording into the quarters of every senior officer in the fleet. It was the sound of human laughter, followed by a single sentence. "We've been in your ships. We've walked your corridors. You never even saw us." It wasn't true. Chris and his team had never actually boarded a Valdrix ship. But the aliens didn't know that, and the fear of what might be true was worse than any weapon. Back on the Defiance, Katie Warren monitored the effects of the psychological campaign. Valdrix ships were moving more slowly now, their crews nervous and distracted. Patrol patterns had become predictable as officers chose safe routes instead of effective ones. "It's working," she told Jake. "Their morale is falling apart." Jake nodded, but his face was troubled. Fear is a double-edged sword. Push too hard, and they might do something desperate. He was right to worry. Admiral Zorvek was changing. The alien commander had always been proud and confident. He had led his fleet to victory after victory, never doubting that he would succeed. But now, for the first time in his long life, he tasted failure. He stopped sleeping. He stopped eating. He spent his days staring at maps and reports, trying to find a pattern in the human attacks. There had to be a weakness. There had to be something he was missing. His officers noticed the change. Zorvek had always been calm and controlled, but now he snapped at anyone who brought him bad news. He ordered executions for minor failures. He became the kind of leader that soldiers feared more than the enemy. The Valdrix fleet was breaking from the inside. Meanwhile, Danny Ruiz finally finished his shield disruption device. It was small enough to fit in a backpack, but powerful enough to shut down the shields on a ship the size of a city. 90 seconds, Danny explained to the team that would carry the device. "That's all you get. After that, the shields will adjust and come back online." The team leader was a woman named Lisa Cole. She was 35 years old with scars on her hands from years of close combat. She had volunteered for the mission without hesitation. 90 seconds is a long time, she said with a grim smile. A lot can happen in 90 seconds. Jake Morrison briefed her personally. The mission was simple on paper. A small shuttle would approach the Valdrix flagship disguised as debris. Lisa and her team would board the ship through a maintenance hatch. They would fight their way to the shield generator, plant the device, and escape before the countdown ended. Simple on paper, almost impossible in reality. "You don't have to do this," Jake told Lisa. "We can find another way." Lisa shook her head. "There is no other way. And even if there was, I'd still volunteer. My family is on Earth. My son is 7 years old. If there's a chance I can protect him, I'll take it." Jake understood. They all had something to fight for. That was what made humans different from the Valdrix. The aliens fought for conquest. Humans fought for love. The mission launched 3 days later. Lisa's shuttle drifted toward the Valdrix flagship, tumbling slowly like a piece of wreckage. The alien sensors scanned it and found nothing of interest, just another rock in the endless darkness. The hatch opened silently. 8 soldiers floated through the gap and into the alien ship. Inside, the corridors were huge. The Valdrix were tall beings, and everything was built to match their size. Lisa and her team moved through the shadows, avoiding patrols and disabling cameras as they went. They reached the shield generator room in 30 minutes. 2 guards stood at the entrance, their weapons ready. Lisa gave the signal. Her soldiers moved without sound, taking down the guards before they could raise an alarm. The door opened, revealing a massive machine that hummed with energy. "Plant the device," Lisa ordered. "We're on the clock." Danny's invention attached to the generator with a soft click. Lisa activated the timer and watched the numbers begin to count down. 90 seconds. 89. 88. Alarms began to sound throughout the ship. The Valdrix knew someone was on board. "Move!" Lisa shouted. Her team ran back toward the shuttle, fighting through the corridors as aliens poured in from every direction. 60 seconds. 59. Outside, the human fleet waited in the shadows. Jake Morrison watched the countdown on his display, knowing that everything depended on what happened next. "Come on, Lisa," he whispered. "Get out of there." The shuttle launched from the flagship with 10 seconds to spare. Behind it, Danny's device activated, sending a pulse through the ship's systems. The shields flickered once, twice, and then died completely. "All ships," Jake commanded. "Fire everything." The asteroid belt erupted with light as the human fleet attacked. Missiles and lasers and railgun rounds slammed into the unprotected flagship. Explosions tore through the hull, ripping the massive ship apart piece by piece. Admiral Zorvek stood on his bridge as the walls collapsed around him. His last thought was one of confusion. How had these primitive creatures defeated him? How had they turned his own fear against him? He never got the answer. The flagship exploded in a ball of fire that lit up the darkness for 1,000,000 miles. And somewhere in the chaos, Lisa Cole's shuttle escaped into the shadows, carrying 8 soldiers who had just changed the course of the war. The death of Admiral Zorvek sent shockwaves through the Valdrix fleet. For 3 days, chaos ruled. Officers argued about who should take command. Ships broke formation as their captains made their own decisions. Some wanted to retreat. Others wanted revenge. In the end, a new leader emerged. Her name was Commander Velris, and she was everything Zorvek had not been. Where he was proud and overconfident, she was careful and patient. Where he had underestimated the humans, she studied them with cold respect. "They are predators," she told her officers, "like the hunting beasts of our home world. They hide and wait and strike when we are weak. We have been fighting them as if they were civilized beings. That was our mistake. Velrys changed everything. She pulled her fleet back from the asteroid belt and gathered them near Jupiter, the massive gas giant that dominated the outer solar system. She arranged her ships in a tight formation, each one covering the others. She set up patrol patterns that overlapped, making it impossible for human ships to slip through. And then she waited. On the Defiance, Jake Morrison studied the new enemy formation with growing concern. The Valdrix had learned from their mistakes. They were no longer scattered and vulnerable. They were a solid wall of metal and firepower, and the human fleet had no way to get through. "We can't use the same tactics," Katie Warren said. "They've adapted." Ben Harper slammed his fist on the table. "Then we attack head-on. Our people are ready to fight." "Our people are ready to die," Megan Torres corrected him gently. "There's a difference." Jake was silent, thinking. He remembered something his father had told him years ago. When you can't go through your enemy and you can't go around them, you have to make them come to you. "We need bait," he said finally. "Something they can't ignore." The plan came together over the next week. It was risky and complicated and probably crazy, but it was also the only chance they had. Captain Aaron Price had been working on a secret project since the beginning of the war. He had taken a small group of engineers to Europa, one of Jupiter's moons, and had been building something in the ice tunnels beneath the surface. A second fleet. It wasn't much. 30 ships, cobbled together from spare parts and salvaged materials. Half of them were barely spaceworthy, but they looked real on sensors, and that was all that mattered. Jake's plan was simple. The main human fleet would reveal itself to the Valdrix, appearing to make a desperate run toward Earth. The aliens would give chase, leaving their defensive formation. And when they did, Aaron's hidden fleet would emerge from Europa and strike them from behind. A trap within a trap. The day of the battle arrived under the cold light of distant stars. Jake stood on the bridge of the Defiance looking at the faces of his crew. They were scared. They were tired. But they were ready. "Whatever happens today," he said, "I want you all to know that it has been an honor serving with you." Katie Warren smiled despite her fear. "Save the speech for after we win, Commander." Jake laughed. It felt good to laugh even now, maybe especially now. The human fleet broke cover and accelerated toward Jupiter. On their sensors, they could see the Valdrix ships responding, turning to intercept. Commander Velrys had taken the bait. The chase lasted for hours. Human ships pushed their engines to the limit, staying just ahead of the alien fleet. Missiles flew back and forth across the darkness, leaving trails of fire in their wake. Jake watched the distance between the fleets carefully. He needed the Valdrix to commit fully to the chase. He needed them focused on the prey in front of them, not the danger behind. "Almost there," Katie reported. "Aaron's fleet is ready. Wait for my signal." The human ships curved around Jupiter, using the planet's gravity to swing toward one of its largest moons. The Valdrix followed, their formation spreading out as faster ships pulled ahead of slower ones. Perfect. "Now," Jake ordered. From the dark side of Europa, Aaron Price led his hidden fleet into battle. 30 ships rose from the ice like ghosts, their weapons already firing. They slammed into the rear of the Valdrix formation, targeting engines and weapon systems. The aliens were caught completely off guard. Ships that had been chasing the humans suddenly found themselves under attack from behind. Commander Velrys screamed orders into her communicator, trying to restore order to her scattered fleet. But it was too late. Jake turned the Defiance around and charged straight into the chaos. "All ships, weapons free. Hit them with everything you have." The Battle of Jupiter's shadow had begun. For 3 hours, the two fleets tore each other apart. Human ships died in flashes of light, their crews lost in an instant. Valdrix cruisers broke under the combined assault, their hulls cracking like eggs. Danny Ruiz had built more shield disruption devices, and they worked exactly as promised. Every 90 seconds, another enemy ship lost its protection. Human missiles found their marks, and explosions painted the darkness. Lisa Cole led another boarding party, this time onto a Valdrix carrier. She and her team fought through corridors filled with smoke and fire, planting explosives in the ship's ammunition storage. The carrier exploded minutes after they escaped, taking 2 nearby cruisers with it. Ben Harper's ship took a direct hit that killed half his crew. He kept fighting with the survivors, his voice never wavering as he called out targets and coordinates. Megan Torres lost her left arm when a console exploded on her bridge. She refused medical treatment until the battle was over, commanding her squadron with cold efficiency despite the pain. Chris Dawson's psychological warfare team broadcast confusion into the Valdrix communication network, making it impossible for the aliens to coordinate their defense. And through it all, Jake Morrison stood at the center of the storm, directing the battle with the calm certainty of a man who had accepted that he might not survive. The turning point came 4 hours into the fight. Commander Velris, realizing that her fleet was being destroyed, made a desperate decision. She ordered all surviving ships to focus their fire on the Defiance. If they could kill the human commander, maybe the rest would fall apart. 40 Valdrix ships turned their weapons toward Jake's carrier. The shields flickered under the assault. Fires broke out on multiple decks. The hull groaned as metal twisted and tore. "We're not going to make it!" Katie shouted over the alarms. Jake looked at her and smiled. "Then let's make sure we take as many of them with us as we can." But Aaron Price had other ideas. The captain pushed his battered ship between the Defiance and the enemy fleet. His vessel was small and old and held together with nothing but hope and duct tape. It wasn't built for combat, but it could still draw fire. "Aaron, what are you doing?" Jake demanded. "Buying you time, Commander. Finish the fight." Aaron's ship exploded 30 seconds later. The blast took out 4 Valdrix cruisers that had gotten too close, and the shockwave pushed the Defiance out of the kill zone. Jake felt the loss like a physical blow. Aaron had been his friend for 20 years. They had trained together, fought together, dreamed together about a future among the stars. Now, he was gone. But the sacrifice had worked. The concentrated fire had stopped, and the human fleet regrouped around the Defiance. They hit the remaining Valdrix ships with renewed fury, fighting not just for Earth anymore, but for everyone they had lost. Commander Velris watched her fleet crumble from the bridge of her damaged cruiser. She had done everything right. She had studied the enemy and adapted her tactics. She had been careful and patient and smart, and she had still lost. The Valdrix Empire surrendered on the 93rd day of the war. Commander Velris sent the message herself, her voice flat and tired. She had taken the remains of her fleet to the edge of the solar system, trying to decide whether to fight on or retreat to Valdrix space. In the end, she chose neither. "We do not understand your species," she said in the transmission. "We have conquered beings with greater technology, larger numbers, and more powerful weapons. None of them fought like you. None of them refused to surrender when defeat was certain." She paused for a long moment, and when she spoke again, there was something almost like respect in her alien voice. "We will leave your system and never return. Perhaps one day when we have learned what makes you so different, we will try again, but not today." The Valdrix fleet vanished into deep space 3 hours later. They left behind the wreckage of their ships, the bodies of their dead, and a mystery they might never solve. On Earth, the news spread like wildfire. People who had spent 3 months hiding in shelters emerged into the sunlight. Families who had been separated found each other again. Strangers hugged in the streets, crying and laughing at the same time. The war was over. Against all logic, against all odds, humanity had survived. But the cost had been terrible. Jake Morrison returned to Earth 2 weeks after the surrender. His ship, the Defiance, was barely able to make the journey. The hull was patched with metal from a dozen different sources. Half the systems were held together with tape and prayers. But it flew, and that was enough. Lucy was waiting for him when he landed. She had grown taller in the months he had been away, her face thinner and more serious. She ran across the landing pad and threw herself into his arms, and Jake held her like he would never let go. His wife Sarah stood back, watching them with tears running down her cheeks. Jake reached out and pulled her into the embrace, and for a few precious minutes, the war and the death and the loss all faded away. They were together. They were alive. Nothing else mattered. The memorial service was held 3 weeks later in a field outside the old United Nations building. Thousands of people gathered under a gray sky to honor the fallen. The names were read aloud, one by one, taking hours to complete. Aaron Price, the captain who had given his life to save the Defiance. His family sat in the front row, his wife clutching the flag that had been draped over his empty coffin. The crew of the carrier, Hope, destroyed in the first week of the war. The soldiers who died boarding enemy ships, the engineers who worked themselves to death keeping the fleet running, the pilots who flew into impossible odds and never came back. Jake Morrison stood at the front and looked out at the sea of faces. He saw his crew, the survivors of the Defiance. Katie Warren had a new prosthetic arm to match the one Megan Torres now wore. Danny Ruiz stood awkwardly to the side, uncomfortable with crowds but unwilling to miss the ceremony. Ben Harper leaned on a cane, his injuries still healing. Lisa Cole was there too, with her son sitting on her shoulders. The boy was too young to understand why everyone was so sad, but he knew his mother was a hero. That was enough for now. "I'm supposed to give a speech," Jake said, his voice carrying across the silent field. "I'm supposed to say something wise and meaningful about sacrifice and courage and all the things that make us human. But the truth is, I don't have the words." He paused, looking down at the paper in his hands. He had written a speech the night before, carefully choosing every phrase. Now it seemed hollow and fake. He put the paper away and spoke from the heart instead. "The Valdricks thought they knew us. They studied our biology and saw weak bodies that broke easily. They studied our history and saw endless wars, nations fighting nations, brothers killing brothers. They looked at all of that and decided we were beneath them. Just another species to conquer." He looked up at the sky, where the clouds were beginning to part. A ray of sunlight broke through, illuminating the field in gold. "They didn't understand that our weakness is our strength. We know what it means to struggle. We know what it means to lose. Every generation of humans has faced something that should have destroyed us, and every generation has found a way to survive. Not because we're stronger than our challenges, but because we refuse to accept defeat." In the crowd, Katie Warren wiped her eyes. She remembered the fear she had felt when the Valdricks first appeared. She had looked at the numbers and seen only death. But Jake had seen something else. He had seen possibility. "The people we lost today didn't die because they were brave," Jake continued. "They were brave, all of them. But that's not why they died. They died because they loved something more than they feared death. They loved their families, their friends, their world. They loved the idea of a future where their children could grow up in peace." He thought of Aaron Price, smiling as he flew his ship into the enemy fleet. He thought of all the soldiers who had volunteered for missions they knew they wouldn't survive. He thought of the quiet courage that had carried humanity through its darkest hours. "We won this war not because we were better than the Valdricks. We won because we had something to fight for. And as long as we remember that, as long as we hold on to the things that make us human, no one will ever defeat us." The ceremony ended as the sun broke fully through the clouds. People began to scatter, heading back to their lives and their families and the long work of rebuilding. But many stayed, standing quietly among the rows of empty graves, remembering. That night, Jake sat on the porch of his house and watched the stars. Somewhere out there, the Valdrix were licking their wounds and wondering what had gone wrong. Somewhere out there, other civilizations were learning about the strange species from the small blue planet that had defeated an empire. Katie Warren stopped by around midnight. She had a bottle of something strong and 2 glasses. "You gave a good speech," she said, sitting down beside him. "I meant every word." "I know. That's what made it good." They drank in silence for a while, watching the stars wheel overhead. The universe seemed different now. Bigger and more dangerous, but also more full of possibility. "What happens next?" Katie asked. Jake thought about the question. The war was over, but the challenges were just beginning. They had to rebuild their fleet. They had to establish defenses that would protect Earth from future invasions. They had to send explorers out into the galaxy and find allies among the stars. "We keep going," he said finally. "That's what humans do. We face whatever comes next, and we keep going." Somewhere in the house, Lucy was sleeping. His daughter had nightmares sometimes, dreams about alien ships and burning cities. But she also had dreams about the future, about traveling to distant worlds and meeting new species and having adventures that Jake couldn't even imagine. That was what they had fought for. Not just survival, but the chance to keep dreaming. 6 months after the surrender, the first human ship left the solar system. It wasn't a warship, just a small explorer with a crew of 12. They were heading for the nearest star, looking for new worlds and new possibilities. Jake watched the launch from the rebuilt command center on Earth. Katie stood beside him, along with Danny and Megan and Ben and Lisa, the survivors, the ones who had carried humanity through its darkest hour. "Think they'll find anything?" Danny asked. Jake smiled. "They'll find everything. That's the amazing thing about the universe. There's always more to discover." The ship vanished into the darkness, its engines leaving a brief trail of light across the stars, and somewhere out there, watching from the shadows, other civilizations took note. The humans were coming. They had faced the greatest military power in the known galaxy and won. They had turned the battlefield upside down and rewritten the rules of war. They had proven that courage and love and stubborn refusal to quit were weapons more powerful than any technology. The Valdrix had thought humans couldn't win. They had been wrong. And now, as humanity took its first steps into the wider universe, one thing was clear. This was only the beginning. The stars belonged to those brave enough to reach for them. And humans, for all their weaknesses and all their flaws, had always been brave. The war was over, the future was waiting, and humanity was ready. "Signal the retreat," she ordered quietly. "All ships, fall back to the system edge." The Valdrix fleet ran. For the first time in their long history, they ran from a battle they couldn't win. When it was over, Jake Morrison sat alone on the bridge of the Defiance. The ship was barely functional. Half his fleet was destroyed. Thousands of his people had died in the battle. But Earth was safe. For now, at least, Earth was safe. Katie Warren found him there an hour later. She didn't say anything. She just sat down beside him and looked out at the stars. The war wasn't over. The Valdrix would regroup and return. There would be more battles, more sacrifices, more loss. But today, against all odds, humanity had won. On the Defiance, the crew erupted in cheers. They had done the impossible. They had killed the enemy commander and destroyed his ship. But Jake Morrison didn't celebrate. He knew the truth. This was a victory. But it wasn't the end. The Valdrix still had 200 ships. They would choose a new leader. They would come back with more anger and more determination than before. The real battle was still ahead. "Get it done," Jake told Danny. "Whatever you need, it's yours." The engineer nodded and hurried back to his workshop. Outside, the asteroid belt stretched on forever, dark and silent and full of secrets. Somewhere out there, the Valdrix were hunting for their enemy. They had better sensors and bigger guns and centuries of experience, but the humans had something else. They had the will to fight, no matter the odds. And soon, the Valdrix would learn just how dangerous that could be. Ife, everyone he had ever known. He would come back for them. He would come back, and he would bring victory with him. But first, he had to teach these aliens something they had never learned in all their centuries of conquest. Humanity did not know how to quit. The first phase had begun. The war for Earth was about to become something the Valdrix had never seen before. And by the time they understood what was happening, it would already be too late.